Welcome to the Startup Grind.
Check,
Yeah.
check, check.
Yeah,
Yep.
you're right.
Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Buenas noches.
Do you want to try to do this in Spanish?
No.
Perfect. First, Dave, thank you very much for being here. It's amazing to have you in Mexico. Why don't we start with Dave Entrepreneur? That's my first subject. Like your
Okay.
first company and what happened with it. It's still live or something?
First company, first legal company? There's a business that, my first business probably is not the one I want to talk about on stage. Although it might work in Colorado these days. I guess the first business I started was in 1992, and was mostly just a small consulting business. Is that working okay? Sounds right? Check, check, yeah.
Can you hear it?
Yeah. So I started doing some database consulting back for Microsoft and a few other clients, Intel. A friend of mine who I was working on a project with, he and I kind of got it started out off the ground, and then we hired some of his friends, and one thing led to another. I guess we started doing different types of consulting and ended up doing internet and e-commerce work maybe towards the end of that. So this was pretty early, I guess 95 to 98 was really when the company went from about 4 people to maybe 20 people. But I made every possible fucking mistake you could think of running a company. That was my first real business, and I was mostly an engineer, not an entrepreneur. I didn't have any formal training in running a company or any finance background. So, we gave equity out unvested. I didn't line up financing. I hired too many people to kind of organize. There's just tons and tons of mistakes that we made. We probably almost died a couple times. We ended up selling to someone for a relatively small amount of money, a little under $1 million, and I made some money out of that. It wasn't a terrible story, but it probably wasn't worth 5 to 7 years of my life. But it was pretty useful for me to understand what it meant to run a business, and to some extent what it meant to run a company and try and organize and lead people. And I wasn't very good at any of those things at that time. So a lot of it was, I guess learning how to deal with adversity and people who were criticizing what I was doing, and most of the times I was agreeing with them about those things. But I guess if you get through that and you come out the other side of it, you end up learning a few things. So hopefully the next time I started, I didn't make quite as many fuck-ups, but I think at one point, I don't know, I had over $100,000 in credit card debt spread across like 11 credit cards or 12 credit cards. That was pretty crazy.
That was your funding?
Mostly it was, a small amount of savings that I had and some cash flow from operations. And a consulting business, you don't need a lot of money to get started. And then I guess we had taken on some leased line debt. But there was a period of time where I probably had $250,000 worth of debt that was in my name, direct or indirect. And I was like, holy shit, I better actually try and make this work. And I was pretty sure I was going to, end up in personal bankruptcy if I didn't. Anyway, we were fortunate, ended up working out okay, but there were a lot of really dark days and, a lot of challenging times. One of my co-founders quit at one point, another one left and took some people with them to a different company. I had a pretty big fight with another one at one point over, probably what was trivial at the time. For a small period of time, I think I was living out of my car while I was doing that, which this is an interesting story, but I was driving a used Lexus at the time. It was about a 10-year-old car, so it wasn't a really expensive car, but my friends used to say that I was the only homeless person they knew who drove a Lexus. But I had been renting, and I'd been working like 16 hours a day, and there was nothing in the apartment I rented other than like a mattress, a TV that wasn't hooked up to cable, and I think my wife's piano at the time, which she was, touring and wasn't using. And I was like, why the hell am I paying money for this apartment? I should, I had an extra room in the office, so I moved everything into the office, and then put a hanger in the back of my car, and put the clothes in the back of the car, and I took showers at the YMCA. So that was like, so needless to say, I didn't have a terribly successful first business. We were probably about 20 people at our height, maybe a couple million, and not quite profitable, which is why we ended up selling. I stayed through the acquisition, through the subsequent company for maybe about a year and a half, and eventually kind of decided to take some time off. But yeah, that was really, it was painful. I learned more about myself, I think, than anything else.
So what happened between that moment and going to PayPal, or getting into PayPal? You went in a couple of companies. Or?
Well, I guess, when I left the acquiring company, I think that was probably at 99, something like that. I took a little bit of time off, and I had been about 3 years overdue on going for a honeymoon with my wife. She had been touring with a music group, and we both had really we hadn't lived in the same city for the first year that we were married, but I didn't really have time even if we had been. So we finally took a little bit of time off. I started doing some consulting, and then eventually was working with a couple of different companies, but eventually found my way to PayPal. Kevin Hartz, who's the founder of Eventbrite, is a friend of mine, and he was an early investor in the company. I was looking for something a little bit less likely to fall apart in the middle of the downturn in 2000, 2001. I guess I'm skipping over a part where I had joined this company that had raised about 40 million in capital and went from 150 people to like 30 people in the period of about 6 months, and I ended up getting laid off from that company. This was during the first dot-com crash around, I think it was spring of 2001, something like that. Anyway, so I had been doing some consulting with a couple of different folks, and Kevin suggested I check out PayPal. And not a lot of people knew about PayPal at the time. It was sort of interesting if you were on eBay and maybe from the tech finance world, but it wasn't a household name at the time.
Does the team was well known, like at that moment?
No,
like Peter and everyone
not really.
else
Peter, I think, was still. Actually, Peter had left the company when the merger from X.com had happened. I don't think people mostly know that story, but PayPal and X.com were sort of both going after internet banking or internet payments, and they merged in, I think, 2000, summer of 2000 or something like that. And it turns out the business model of PayPal was the one that actually worked, but Elon, who was running X.com at the time, ended up taking over as the CEO, and Peter ended up becoming chairman and kind of retiring. And then I guess Max and Elon were fighting about something, and it was probably related to operating systems. I think Elon was a Microsoft advocate at the time, and Max was a violently open source advocate. So I think Elon either went on vacation or went to World Cup or something and came back, and there was this big palace coup, and he had been un-CEO'd out of the office. And Peter came back in and was running the company. But there were a lot of people who went on to much greater things later that were not very big names at the time.
How long did you were in PayPal before beginning to work in the Facebook fund?
I was there for about 3 years, a little over 3 years. Between 2001 and 2004, I joined. Actually, the day I was supposed to start was 9/11. That was kind of an inauspicious day. But I joined PayPal about 6 months before the company went public, and then through the eBay acquisition later. So a lot of the time when I joined PayPal was actually pretty easy. I think a lot of the tougher times that PayPal faced had happened right before I got there. There's a period of time, I think in summer of 2000, when they were losing, $5 to $10 million a month to Russian fraudsters, and there was other times when card associations were suing them, and attorney generals of various states were suing them. I think the day that we went public, our attorney, lead counsel, hadn't slept for 3 days in New Orleans. Louisiana was trying to sue us, so it was a very challenging environment. A lot of people didn't want PayPal to succeed.
So after that, you went to the Founders Fund.
That was actually quite a bit later. There's about 4 years there where I was doing
In the middle, okay.
angel investing and working at Simply Hired and helping out with Mint and a few other places.
So what's the jump between being in the Founders Fund with Sean Parker and everything, and then start working in something called 500 Startups?
When I was leaving PayPal in 2004, I'd started to do some angel investing. So about, I guess, 4 years between 2004 and 2008, did about 13 investments on my own with some of the money I made from PayPal. Probably about 300,000 in total. And I was not really paying attention too much, but I got lucky with at least 3 of those 13 investments. Mint.com, SlideShare, and Mashery were all over $100 million exits, and not a huge sum, but
you were angel, so you were early there.
Mostly those were small checks, anywhere from say 10 to 25,000.
Okay.
But that worked out okay, and I'd been starting to try and put a fund together in 2007 and 2008, and then around 2008 summer, the financial crisis, another financial crisis hit, so that was not a good time to start a fund. And Sean had been trying to recruit me to come into Founders Fund to do marketing. I had initially told him no, and then I kind of came crawling back and said, "Hey, you still got that job?" But I asked him if I could have a little bit of money to invest, and he was very kind to give me a couple $1 million and, here, go play in a corner, Dave, don't hurt yourself. And then I also had the chance to take over and run the Facebook fund that Excel and Founders Fund had put together. So, it was a small amount of capital compared to what Founders Fund was typically investing.
But there were big players in there, right? Like Excel and...
Excel was certainly a big player. Founders Fund was starting to become a big player. They were working on their second fund. It was about $200 million at the time. Sean had, left Facebook. Peter had already made money with PayPal and was an investor in Facebook, so they were certainly set. But then over that next year and a half period, I made about 40 or so investments, half through Founders Fund and then half through the FB Fund. And, we got a chance to invest in some really great companies, Twilio and SendGrid, Credit Karma, Wildfire, which got sold to Google for about $350 million, and a company called Zimride, which later became Lyft, that just raised money at a $3 billion valuation. So we invested in Lyft, I think at around a $3 million valuation. They just raised money at a $3 billion valuation. So we did okay, I guess, with those.
So I'm from there.
I didn't make that much money out of that. They all made that money, but anyway.
Yeah, you can go ahead and have a sip. So, Geeks on a Plane. I'm guessing that's what it took to get you into Mexico.
Yeah, I think that was when we came down here for the first time. I'm trying to remember, but probably 2011.
Do you remember
or 12?
Who you meet with?
Well, we certainly met with Cesar and Santiago, and was it 2012? Yeah, okay. And Beji was on that trip also, I think, right? Beji, you're here somewhere? Yes. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think we'd already sort of made the investment in Mexico. I don't think I had come down until after that, but yeah, it was pretty fun.
It was the first time that you looked at this Paul Ostrom big presentation about Mexico?
Oh, right, yes. I think we had... I sort of knew that Latin America was interesting. Yeah, but Paul's presentation really opened my eyes to a lot of potential. I think that was when I kind of got really excited about, okay, we should really do more in Mexico and Latin America. But I think Beji had already been, opening our eyes to Brazil and the opportunities south of the U.S.
Okay. And then you met with Cesar and Santiago, and you meet this thing called Mexican VC. And why it makes sense for you?
Yeah, and actually, I think even before that, David Weekley, who was also one of the people that helped get Mexican VC off the ground, he was a friend of mine. Actually, didn't I meet you guys when you came to Stanford? I think I met either Cesar sometime way back you were still doing Happy Dev Funhouse or something like that. Super Happy Fun Dev Funhouse, yeah. Anyway, David had been asking me about how to get a fund started, and I think we had found out about Mexican VC through him, and then got to know them better. But when we met Paul and Alta's presentation, I think we kind of figured, yeah, there's really more opportunity here than we thought. And when we met some of the companies through Mexican VC, we got pretty excited about that.
So you acquired Mexican VC as 500?
Yeah, I think there's a very famous picture of me holding Cesar under my shoulder with a luchadores hat on. And, that was a very offensive press release that I think some people didn't like. But we had fun. That was probably one of my favorite press releases ever. Yeah.
But why it makes sense?
Why it makes sense? Well,
Yeah.
they had already figured out what was going on down here, and I think they had the accelerator up and running, and so it was kind of a great opportunity for us to come in and work with them. So that was a pretty easy decision for us, really.
Okay. Nice. So right now, you have this fund, and this fund is operating locally or globally, the fund of 500?
So we are still raising our third fund. We're about to wrap that up. And then the local fund, 500 Luchadores, has been investing here for the last 3 years. I think there's about 60 or 70, 75 companies now. 79, yeah. And then we also invest out of the main fund into some of those companies as well.
Okay. So going through other interviews that you had or something, you were you invested over 1,000 startups, right?
I think I'm supposed to wait on that announcement until after we have the press line.
Well,
but
999 startups.
We're
okay.
almost there, yes.
Let's go with 999.
Sometime between last month and next month, we will cross over 1,000 companies.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but 1/3 of them will die, 1/3 of them will survive, and 1/3 of them will thrive.
I think I've been quoted as saying that. It's probably more like half of them will die, and another quarter will survive, and then the last quarter we might make some money out of those.
Just to go with numbers, it's like 300 will thrive, so 45 to 60 companies will exit, and 5 to 10 will have a big exit, or will have a big value.
I think it'll be a little bit more than that. I think out of the first 1,000, my guess is we'll probably get 150 to 200 exits. Probably 75 to 100 of those will be substantial, and probably 25 of those will be where most of the
a big hit.
Most of the money comes from. But I mean, it's hard to say. We'll have to see how it all plays out. I think right now it looks like about 1 to 2% of portfolio could have these 50x sort of outcomes that other VCs aim for, but probably it's more about 5 to 7% of them that can have 20x outcomes, where I think those are more realistic things that we know. We've already seen those happen. And even, a smaller set of outcomes, but probably a larger number of companies, we might see, 50 to 100 exits at between, say, 5 to 25 million. So each of those three sort of, the really big ones, the medium-sized ones, and the small ones all hopefully add up over time. But I don't think we are relying on just the big exits for kind of making the fund work.
Yeah, that's a difference between you and maybe Y Combinator that are looking forward to these super huge exits, and they don't care a lot about smaller exits or medium exits.
I don't know if I would say that. I don't want to put words in Sam's mouth, but I think YC's had about a 5-6 year head start on us. They have some really great companies, and they've been at it longer than we have. It's probably more similar between our approaches than there is different. I think we're both probably quite different from other larger VCs that are doing maybe only 30 to 40 investments per fund. Probably us and YC are the most active investors around.
So besides Credit Karma, that I think it's the bigger company you had in your portfolio.
Yeah.
Who are the top 3?
Depends on how you're measuring that. Sexiest, or what do you mean?
I think value.
Value, okay. Not return or increase in value, but absolute value.
Absolute
okay.
value.
I think probably, So Lyft isn't in the portfolio because I made that out of a different fund. That would be probably
Same with
the
Mint,
most.
right? Mint was outside. the
Yeah,
portfolio.
Mint was personal. Credit Karma is probably over $1 billion.
That's the biggest one, right?
Yeah, they raised money at a valuation that was reported over $1 billion. Twilio, and then it's hard to say what's next after that. There's 3 or 4 companies that are probably around the $250 to $500 million range.
You can promote them now.
Well, we had an exit with MakerBot at around $400 million and Wildfire at $350 million. But there's several companies: SendGrid, RealReal, BarkBox. Probably forgetting a few others that might be also in that
The same level.
At that, more than $100 million, maybe less than $500 million. I feel weird. I mean, that's not like. I love the fact that we were invested in those companies, but I'm probably more proud of the fact that we've had companies come out of our accelerator that are maybe, successful at any level, not necessarily monetary.
Okay.
And a lot of those maybe we didn't expect to. We've started to have some companies now that I think will be worth 50 to 100 million or are already out of the accelerator. And some of our seed investments have already done quite well. One that Beji did in Brazil, Viva Real, is doing real estate listings in Brazil. And another one she did, Conta Azul's doing small business bookkeeping. So those are both, very successful companies already in Brazil. There's a bunch here in Mexico that I think are going to do quite well as well. Yaxi and 99 Minutos, probably a few others that I'm forgetting at the moment, but they'll remind me soon.
So, do you think we can apply the same numbers to Latin America, thinking about, you told that you have maybe 100 companies in Latin America, 1/3 die, 1/3 survive, and 1/3 thrive. So that means that you may have 4 to 6 exits and half to 1 company in big hits. Do you have a big hit in Latin America?
Yeah, I think we do. I mean, again, Viva Real company just raised $40 million from Spark Capital out of the U.S., so that's a multi-$100-million company. We've had several that have already raised Series A's here as well, but the companies here are still probably 2 or 3 years old, so it's not as far along yet. But my guess is maybe out of 100 investments in Latin America, those numbers probably hold up. I think we'll get 30 to some sort of an exit, and maybe 5 to 10 of them to a larger exit.
Okay. What do you think about?
Is that surprising? I mean, why do you think that's even like a question, I guess?
No, I think it's interesting to know the big companies doing great things.
Don't you guys believe that? Do you? See, I think this is actually what's most interesting, is probably the biggest thing holding people back is not because there's not investment, or not because there's not great talent, or not because there's not enough customers. It's because the entrepreneurs have convinced themselves that they're not the right person. I think that's, you put Silicon Valley on this pedestal and you think that they're better than you are. They're not. You're just as good. In fact, sometimes you're better because you have to hustle harder and you don't have access to as much capital, and you don't have a bunch of bullshit people sort of like throwing social media dollars around. You actually have to make a real business work. So I think in a lot of cases, mostly what's lacking in Latin America as well as in other places is just, it's in your head. You just have a lack of confidence because you see somebody up on this hill and you're like, oh, they're up on that hill, but like they climbed up that hill too, and you guys probably will get there. In a lot of cases, there are companies that have already gotten there. I think really, it's surprising that you asked me that question, because it's like, yeah, well, of course, it's going to happen. But a lot of people, they're probably still doubting because it hasn't maybe happened as much. I think people forget that Silicon Valley took 50 to 60 years to develop. It didn't happen in 10 years. A lot of the internet community here in Mexico has just started 5, 10 years ago. Not maybe 10 years ago, right? And so you're trying to compare yourself to somebody who's been at it for 50 years. Like me trying to look at YC, I'm like, holy shit, they've got 4, 5, 6 companies. They're $1 billion companies. How are we ever going to catch them? And they just started 5 years earlier. And so I think a lot of it, you have to get out of your own head and realize. When I first started doing consulting for Microsoft and Intel, I was like, holy shit, I'm doing consulting for Microsoft and Intel. This is amazing. And like a year later, I was like, God, these guys are fucked up. I can do this so much better. I was like, you really just, seeing yourself a year later or seeing other people like you who can do things, like it takes the shine off. It's like not impossible anymore. I think that's really important.
So we know you're a big fan of Angel and Naval, and you're
Angelist
actually
and Naval, yes.
an investor. Do you
Very
think it works in Mexico? Do you think Mexicans should start using a platform like that? And will you do it? If you're a Mexican company, will you go in there, and how will you raise money from there?
Yeah, I think it can work. I mean, I think we have to work maybe a little bit harder to develop the audience on the investor side. That's probably where there's not. I mean, in the US, you have a traditional pattern of lots of people investing in startups, particularly in the Valley. A lot of tech entrepreneurs, a lot of people who've been, rank and file employees at other companies. Lots and lots of people are angel investors. I think in Mexico and maybe some other countries that isn't quite as prevalent. So you probably have to work a little harder to develop that audience. But I do think now you're starting to see people who are, high net worth individuals, whether they're in Mexico or of Hispanic descent in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, who are interested in investing. And so, probably a lot of folks in Miami and maybe also in LA and New York that have ethnic ties to Mexico or the Hispanic market. I think they would understand and be open to investing. So we may have to go find those people more particularly and run those ideas by them, but I think we can do it.
So what's the big difference you see between LPs from Mexico and LPs from the US?
Well, I mean, I think the market in Mexico is growing faster in a lot of places. So for a lot of people to look at doing startup investments where I was saying, half or more of things may end up not returning any capital whatsoever, and they're like, well, that seems pretty risky. And if I look at real estate or cement or other commodity and utility businesses, there's lots of people making money in those areas that are growing quite quickly. So I think it's a tougher bet for a lot of emerging markets that already have fast growth economies to bet on startups when that's still very new. And they might have real estate or other types of more traditional investing that are performing well.
I heard an opinion from you, and I like it a lot, regarding mortgages.
Yeah.
That if you invest in startups, you can go only as low as 0. But if you go all the way with mortgages, you can go far beyond 0, right?
I think I was talking about leverage as an investor, and my statement was when you invest in a startup, you can only lose all the money that you invest. So with a house, you can lose 20 times the money that you invest. And some folks in the US have found that out in the last few years. So I find it interesting that the US government is trying to regulate investing in startups when they don't really regulate investing in housing. In fact, they actually subsidize and encourage investment in housing, and they'd often look the other way when massive fraud and abuse and scandal is happening in the housing market. So they're spending a lot of energy to make sure that grandmothers are safe investing in startups. They might want to spend an equal amount of energy making sure they've got a house over their heads. But yeah, I think the great thing about startups is, you might lose money, but you only lose the money you invest. If you make money, you might make 20 times the money you invest. Doesn't happen very often, but occasionally it does.
It does. Well, I have a couple of unfair questions for you, and I hope you can answer it.
Okay.
First, what's your favorite startup in Mexico?
What's my favorite startup in Mexico? That's easy. It's called 500 Luchadores. It's my team.
What do you think about the government role in Mexico regarding entrepreneurship?
True answer.
Well, to put it kindly, I think they could do more.
Or less.
No, I mean, I think there's a place. People tend to think that government has no place in venture capital, and I think that's not correct. In fact, if you look at the history of venture capital in the US, there was a lot of government subsidies that helped some of the early funds get started. Most people are not aware of that, but there was tens of billions of dollars invested into helping venture capital funds get started in the US. So venture capital is a subsidized market. And I think for a lot of places, it's important to have the government be involved in getting that ecosystem off the ground. Now, I don't know that I really want government officials making the choices on the investment side. I think it's probably better structure to have private investors who have money at risk make those choices and maybe use the government capital to subsidize or help match some of that capital. In some cases, it might be even more effective to use government capital to assist with exits and liquidity. In fact, in a lot of markets, governments are subsidizing capital on the front end on investment when they're not really looking at the back end of that market, and how exits occur is usually really a lot more critical to getting functional ecosystems. That said, I think there's probably more that government can do. I think from our personal experience, there was a lot of intent to be helpful, but at the end of the day, I don't think they got over the finish line on a few things.
The last mile.
Yeah, so, I think we've had to do a lot of things ourselves anyway, and that's fine. I think we were up to the task and we got after it regardless, but yeah, I think it would have been nicer if there had more things had happened or we hadn't spent quite so much time in that area. I'm optimistic that might change in the future.
Well, I have to tell a little story. It's not very nice, but correct me if I'm wrong, but Dave didn't want to invest in Uber. That's correct? So the question is why Uber didn't make sense at that moment.
Yeah.
Why Uber wasn't good enough to invest.
So I didn't screw this up once. I screwed this up multiple times. I was in 2010, I had been looking for an investment in taxi companies. I should pull out this email so I look at it. Every once in a while I just pull it out and look at it just to, why did I say no? Yeah, let's see if I can find it. It wasn't called Uber at the time, it was called Uber Cab, I think.
And it was just black cars, right?
It was just black cars. Travis, 2010. This is super painful. It's like, bang yourself in the head with a hammer, like, oh, I just said yes. Anyway, I can't find it. But yeah, June 2010. Travis was a friend of mine. I had met him a few years back, and we used to hang out at a few conferences. He and another founder, the Stumble Upon founder, Garrett Camp, were both investors in Uber Cab. I think it was called Uber Cab at the time, or Uber Taxi. And Travis had already had an exit, and so Garrett had already had some success with Stumble Upon. So they both were rich already, and they were raising money for the company at a $10 million, I think it was $10 million valuation, which I thought was expensive, and I thought they were rich playboys who weren't going to really pay too much attention, and there were other companies I was looking at in the space that had a little bit more traction at the time and a lower price. But I was fucking wrong. Jesus. Yeah. Let's just say I was still closing our first fund. So part of the problem was I had not finished closing our first fund yet. That would happen about 2 months later. And so I was trying to figure out, do I write a personal check for like $10,000, or do I try and finagle a way to get a 50 to 100K allocation in that $10 million round, which he probably would have held for me. But I'm pretty sure, let's just say I only did a $50,000 investment. I'm pretty sure that today that investment would be worth not less than $100 million. Probably more.
Tough life.
And here's the other thing was like, so I mentioned that I had invested in Lyft when it was a different company when I was running Facebook Fund. So the Lyft guys came to me about 12 months later, I think. And they're like, hey, we figured it out. We're going to like pivot and compete with Uber. And, do you want to invest in another round? And I was like, nah, Uber's going to crush you guys. I'm not going to invest in you either. So I missed it fucking twice. I was looking for this investment, and it came up and bit me in the ass twice. And I was like, oh, no, I don't need that. And then, of course, after those, I missed investing. I did not invest in any of the subsequent rounds of Uber or Lyft, which I could have. So now I get to tell this story.
So one of the big things with you guys is, with 500 is, like, you're working out to make more investment in women or women founder. My question is, how do you manage to have more women founder? Because to avoid being biased and investing because they're women, how did you manage to increase the women you're investing in?
Well, first of all, I guess, it's still a minority of our investments. I think we've invested probably in about maybe 250 companies that have women founders, so it's about 25% of our portfolio. I think probably about 150 female CEOs, depending on how you want to count that. So it's still, at best 1 in 4, maybe only 1 or 5 or 6, depending. There's a lot of women running great companies out there, I think, that are not getting very much attention. Sometimes it's, I don't think you see complete, sexism going on and investing in the U.S. Sometimes you see subtle biases, but I think that there's definitely something going on there. We were fortunate in that we had a couple of female founders who did very well with their businesses early. In particular, Rashmi Sinha was at SlideShare, I was a personal investor in, and Victoria Ransom at Wildfire, and a few others as well. So some of our best investments have been in women CEOs or companies with women founders. I think probably most formative for me was my mom was a entrepreneur, at least of sorts, maybe only for sort of small business, but she was mostly a single parent, and for me, the person who I looked up to, who sort of, managed the family finances and started businesses, was a woman who was a very strong. My mom is she's a very Italian, very strong-minded woman, and she will let you know. A lot of my four-letter vocabulary comes from her. So, at least for me, seeing women in positions of power or authority was very straightforward, and I just, and a lot of people we, brought on at 500 were also women. So that's always been something I think that was just easier for me to visualize. I think maybe for other guys who weren't brought up in those circumstances, but they might have different sex.
It wasn't because you were trying to cover like a quota of having like, hey, we have 5 men in the team, we must look for 5 women in the team. It wasn't like that, or?
No, I don't think we ever want to do that. I think we still want to find companies that have potential. We might bias a little bit towards, women or minorities or international founders, but I think some of that is really, this sounds weird, we're doing it because we're selfish, not because we're being charitable. A lot of those folks are looked over by other people and they're undervalued. And so I think the soundbite I've often said is we're arbitraging racism and sexism to our own benefit, and we think that those people work harder. So usually investing in international companies or women or minorities or anything that just in general looks different than, white guys from MIT and Stanford, we think those people are going to outperform relative to the rest of the market's opinion. And so while there is racism or sexism out there, we think investing in women and minorities is a great buy.
They will pay off better eventually. They might.
I think so, yeah.
So
I wish there were more who were looking for capital. We would probably try and get above 50% if it were possible. We're still trying to expand those opportunities.
So last question before we can go on and people can ask you a couple of questions.
Sure.
You don't like to be impeached in places or in venues or in events, and I heard that you were like,
I don't like to be uncreatively pitched. There's always, for something that's interesting, I'll pay attention. But usually people are not so creative.
so you don't like to talk about it, but I want to talk about it, how to hack Dave. This is very
How
important.
to hack Dave?
How to hack Dave. So let me tell you a couple of things that I pick
Don't
up.
pitch me in the urinal or on the dance floor. How about that?
A couple of things that I pick up from other interviews that you had. First of all, you want to hear a lot about what the people had accomplished before. You don't want to hear about how
not
they
so much
will grow and
accomplished.
become this huge company and they will be like the Uber
All
for
I'm saying is-
strippers or anything.
What? I think what I said is when people talk in the future tense, I don't care as much as when they talk in the past tense. So, like, tell me what you have accomplished or what you have done, not what you're going to do. Even if those are, maybe things that you might think are minor accomplishments. So, I mean, usually when we look at companies, we don't look at revenue projections forward. We don't look at what the entrepreneur is saying about what's going to happen in the future. Those are mostly lies and imagination. And we look at the last 3 to 6 months. We look at what the company's been doing and what has the entrepreneur done in their past, whether they were working in another company or building a product or selling a product. Most of the times you're doing historical, fact checking. You're not like believing in the future. So I don't know why people do revenue projections. I don't know why investors ask for them. They're usually a bunch of bullshit. And if you want to invest in people who are good script writers or good at telling you what you want to hear, then great, you could do that. But I think in most of the cases we want to look at product, we want to look at customer metrics, we want to look at historical data that's fairly recent. I don't think venture capital really is that hard. It's not like a lot of people in the industry walk around like they're God's gift to humanity, and the fact of the matter is you're just writing a check. You are a checkbook writer. You're not as much of an entrepreneur or a founder. So and the other thing is if you look at the history of venture capital and the returns, it's arguable whether founders fail more often or VCs fail more often. You could make the case that VCs are shittier at their business than entrepreneurs are at theirs. So we should probably be a lot more humble about what we're doing. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with all of this, but...
Don't worry. The other thing that I heard, and it was very interesting, is a lot of VCs told entrepreneurs that they want to hear the story. And I heard that you have a very strong position about it. They are like, hey, tell me your story. Make me believe that you are at some point involved with the product or with the service. And you were like, I really don't care about your story.
Well, I care about the customer's story. And to some extent, I care about your story relative to the customer. But I think people get caught up in trying to be Steve Jobs and
Have a
telling
great
this
story. Yeah.
grand vision of what my life as an entrepreneur. And, if you think being an entrepreneur is fabulous, then you have got another thing coming. It's a pain in the ass. Being an entrepreneur is a lot of hassle and a lot of work. So I think what we look for are people who are passionate about solving customer problems, and not people who are passionate about being an entrepreneur. These days everybody wants to be an entrepreneur. It's like, being an entrepreneur is the new rock star. I think guys do startups to get laid now. I don't know if women do startups for that reason, but guys think startups are really sexy, and
Super
seems
hot.
like some women think so too, but that's not a good reason. I think that what we look for is people who are slightly crazy and obsessed with solving a problem, probably irrationally so. And the reason we look for that is because we want you to get through the tough times that are most likely to happen when your business isn't always working positively. And so if you choose an idea because you think it's fun or sexy, you're going to look cool, and then things start going south, you're probably not going to stick with it. You're going to go look for the next sexy, cool thing, that's easier. If you're obsessed about, I don't know, your mom's vision or your uncle's kids who, need some education product, or if you're obsessed about something or other, you might stick with it even when times are bad. And that's, I'm obsessed about startups and trying to help people figure shit out, and this isn't necessarily the easiest business to do. It's taken me 20, 25 years to get to where I'm at right now. And, if I'm lucky, we might make some money, but I know the numbers, and most VCs don't make that much money. So it looks good from the outside, but I think you want to find people who are passionate about what they're doing, and what they're doing is solving customer problems, not worshiping at the Church of Lean Startup or doing some other shit.
Well, and having fun.
Having fun is important. Having fun is almost, in our company, we say having fun is actually a priority because we don't pay you very well and we work you really hard. And so if you're not having fun, that's a shitty bargain. You better enjoy what you're doing. In case it doesn't work, you've at least had some fun. Yeah, I think, in fact, too many people in business don't let themselves have fun. It's, starting a startup is hard. You might as well have a good time trying it.
Well, thank you very much, Dave.